Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the third in our series of pop-up assessment seminars to support the quality assurance practitioners. And we're delighted and excited actually about today's program, and I suppose we're bringing more professionals from DCU to help share more practice with you. Now, today's venue is being recorded, as Laura has just set the recording button, just to let you know. And also, we have everybody on mute, but please don't see that as an invitation not to share your questions in the chat. Our presenters today are very eager to hear from you. They've already presented you with some outline questions, but they're eager to hear your questions. So please be forthcoming with the chat. Again, as this is a series of events that's supporting the QA practitioners, if you're not a QA practitioner, don't panic. There's plenty here for everybody. Please stay connected. Our QA team, of course, is here to support you in any way that they can. If you want to provide any follow-up questions or areas of practice that you are interested in sharing in this type of format, please contact any of our staff, such as Walter, Peter, myself, Laura, Carmel, Marie Gould, or any of the other staff that you liaise with. Please feel free to come forward and offer up any resources that you have, because we'd like to keep this series of seminars going. So just again to state that this is a cross-organisation issue that we're quite anxious to support you in. So with qualifications, quality assurance, and the stakeholder engagement division working towards supporting you in this particular context. So without any further delay, I'll just ask my colleague Peter to formally open this session, and we can move on to our presenters.
Hello, I'm Peter Cullen, Head of Research and Innovation at QQI, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce the third event in our blended learning seminar series for QA practitioners. As Karina said, it'll last about an hour and it'll be recorded. Today we're going to, in a way, go back to first principles to hear about the alignment between intended learning outcomes, teaching, learning, and assessment. The COVID-19 emergency highlighted, I think, the importance of this topic, as institutions have to prioritise opportunities for the achievement and demonstration of essential learning outcomes. Hopefully today will help provide some pointers on how to decide what you really need to assess and how you can ensure that the assessment load is warranted and that problematic bunching, if you like, of assessment can be avoided. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Zita Lysaght and Professor Michael O'Leary with us today to talk about aligning assessment, learning, teaching for quality assurance in further and higher education. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like you to think about what you'd like to get out of today's event. And let us know in the chat if you have any specific questions or if there are specific topics that you would like to see addressed. We've already invited you to send in questions in advance of the event, and if you've already done this, there's no need to add these to the chat again. But if you haven't had a chance to respond to that call for questions, use the chat, and Michael and Zita may not be able to respond to all the requests, but they'll do their best to tailor the presentation to the interests expressed. And now to introduce the speakers, the first two speakers rather. Dr. Zita Lysaght is a member of the School of Policy and Practice at the Institute of Education, St. Patrick's Campus, DCU, and her teaching and research focus primarily on assessment literacy and research methodology. Professor Michael O'Leary holds the Prometric Chair in Assessment at DCU, where he also directs the Centre for Assessment Research, Policy and Practice in Education, CARPE. He leads a programme of research at CARPE focused on assessment across all levels of education and in the workplace. After Zita and Michael make their presentation, we're going to hear from the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching, Learning and Assessment. The forum maintains a wonderful repository of resources for teaching, learning, and assessment practitioners, and Dr. Alison Farrell of the forum of the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning will present some of these resources to you. Finally, I'd like to reiterate what Karina has already said, that this is an area that we're really anxious to support right across the organization of QQI, and we intend to follow up by engaging with stakeholders on a one-to-one basis in some cases to explore what more we can do to help support the sector. So without further ado, may I invite Zita and Michael to make their presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter and Karina and Laura. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. We were delighted to respond. And just given that my name is Michael O'Leary, I'm sorry if I disappointed you, if you thought it was somebody maybe a little bit more belligerent was going to be on the presentation today. It's the greatest icebreaker name ever, let me tell you. So when I introduce myself as Michael O'Leary, I think people never think there's another Michael O'Leary in the whole world. Anyway, Zita will speak in a moment. If I can just maybe give a little plug to CARPE, the Centre for Assessment Research at DCU. It's easy enough to find. The acronym is CARPE. We do lots of really interesting research on, for example, remote proctoring. We're funded by a licensing and credentialing company, and they've had to pivot online, and lots of high stakes certification assessments have had to go online. So we've done a lot of work on remote proctoring. We do a lot of work on computer-based assessments and lots of other assessment stuff. So maybe a trawl through our website. Zita works as a research associate with us. So anyway, we think we're doing some interesting work, and not just within regular education, but also in the workplace. Anyway, our job today is to talk about aligning assessment, learning and teaching for quality assurance in further and higher education contexts. And in the presentation, we want to highlight what we consider to be some pretty essential concepts underlying efforts to ensure that assessment, teaching and learning, that those things are well aligned in our programs. So I suppose it's really around some of the essential concepts. We have, at the end, we've got some practical stuff, but we really want you to really think about some of the key concepts. Now, we're not presumptuous enough to think that everything we're going to say today will be new to you. In actual fact, some of it may be very familiar to you. We hope, though, that there will be some new things, or indeed maybe things that you were vaguely familiar with, and that we'll be able to shed some light on. I mean, our hope is that at the end, that you'll bring away at least one idea or one possible action that you might think about mulling over, something that might just improve what you do in terms of your work in quality assurance. So next slide. So we have our 3 guiding questions, and we're going to kind of stick to these, and I know Zita's keeping an eye on the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to weave in maybe some of the issues that you bring up in the chat box. But we really think that these are probably pretty overarching anyway, and it won't be that difficult maybe to fit some of your concerns underneath them. So we want to deal really with, well, what does alignment mean in the first place? And what does it mean in the context of assessment, learning and teaching? And why do we think it matters? Why do we feel it's important? And I suppose what we're going to try to do is provide you with a perspective. And it's not necessarily a perspective that we feel that we're right, or that we're totally right or partially wrong. We're pretty committed to it, but we feel that we can articulate the rationale for why we think the alignment issue is important. And then as practitioners, and we're not just theorists, we do walk the walk. We know there are challenges involved in aligning learning teaching, and we know there are challenges within programs, and in terms of quality assurance as well. We think there are challenges once you go into that space of quality assurance we feel that we have some experience. We'll talk about this in a little while. So I'm just going to hand over to Zita, who will take you through the next slide, please.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everybody. My thanks to Laura and to Karina and Peter for your very warm welcome. This is one of those quotations that I like because it always causes me pause for thought. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. Now, Michael has outlined for you the 3 questions that we think, you know, will best guide our presentation this afternoon and will lead to the most fruitful kind of conversation. But we are mindful that there may be other issues which are pressing for you. So I've been looking at the chat and I haven't seen a huge amount coming in there, but perhaps towards the end, we might be able to look at some of those with you. Moving through the presentation, as Michael said a moment ago, we will, you know, allude to, I suppose, our own experiences at times, just to elucidate some of the maybe the more theoretical things that we're talking about. Next slide, please. So the first question which we're posing is, what does alignment mean in the context of assessment, learning and teaching? And again, next slide, please. So, you know, we know that there are a lot of definitions in the literature in relation to alignment. And so what we're proposing here is what we think is something reasonably simple and uncomplicated, but at the same time, it really captures what we consider to be the salient points. So as it says on the slide, an aligned program of study or a program is one in which the 3 core functions of assessment, learning and teaching are all directed towards a shared or a common goal. And in this case, the common goal is the optimization of student learning. And further, it's a program in which the assessment, the learning and the teaching elements or functions reinforce one another rather than what sometimes happens where they compete with one another or they're out of sync in some way. Now, in my view, and I think Michael shares this perspective, the principle of alignment, and more specifically what we'll come on to in a moment or two, what Biggs calls constructive alignment, is really a threshold concept. I think Mayer and Land would describe it as such, because once the idea of alignment or conceptual alignment takes hold, it really causes or induces a qualitative shift, in my view, in the way in which we think about assessment, learning and teaching, how they are related to each other and how they can be used to inform and to optimize student learning. Next slide, please. And specifically, and this has been my experience at least, you know, the concept of alignment caused a pretty fundamental shift actually in my understanding and my perspective on the relationship between teaching, learning and assessment. And it really challenged me to move from what we use, maybe it's just a colloquial term, as to refer to a linear model of assessment, learning and teaching, where, you know, the teacher teaches, the expectation is the student learns, and then the teacher assesses, and then the process repeats. And there aren't necessarily, you know, reciprocal kind of or there aren't points where one feeds into the other as one might expect. Now, you know, Biggs' big idea of constructive alignment, you know, really challenges us, I think, to move our understanding to a whole new level. So when we talk about constructive alignment as it's conceptualized by Biggs, really what we're talking about is alignment as a mode of instructional design. That's its principal function. It's a framework. It's something that, you know, supports the process that we go through when we try to design and evaluate instructional programs. But I think that it challenges us to do so in a far more dynamic and purposeful manner. And there are 3 key, you know, elements, if you like, to this. The first, which is at the top of the slide there, you know, is about the learning outcomes. what we want our students to be able to do, what we want them to learn, what we want them to be able to understand and to master through engagement in a particular course of study. That's linked to the teaching and learning activities, those resources, those opportunities that we very deliberately structure and we very deliberately design, reflecting the learning outcomes that we have selected to begin with. And they, of course, in turn, those teaching and learning activities are in turn linked to our assessment tasks. You know, how we propose that our learners will produce the evidence, if you like, or of their learning, the artifacts, the exam results that demonstrate that we have succeeded in the teaching and learning activities that we've provided, and indeed in the nature of the assignments that we provide. We've given them the opportunity to not only master the learning outcomes, but to demonstrate to us with confidence that, you know, they have met the learning outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is easy. In fact, to be honest, it's something that I have to put up my hand right now and say that this is something I have to work on all of the time. And I think that we're in a particularly challenging situation currently. I thought it was challenging last March when we pivoted from face-to-face to a blended model, but now I confess I'm finding it extremely challenging to teach, you know, very large groups of students. In one case, I've got 435 students on a webinar for 2 hours on a Monday, and I've never met them. So I'm really missing the blended, at the very least, the blended opportunity. So when we talk about the process and drill down in the process of constructive alignment, I know that this is sometimes referred to this alignment as the Bermuda Triangle, and it's easy to get lost, but I do think that there are some important messages that we just need to keep, you know, in working memory. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the messages or some of the important the points that I try to bear in mind when I'm writing learning outcomes and when I'm then trying to craft teaching and learning activities that speak to those and assessment tasks that are fair and yield fair, valid and reliable inferences. So the first thing I'd say to you is that when we talk about the learning outcomes, and I should have said something here, so I'm going to just pause for a second. There was one other point I needed to make here in relation to this particular construction or way of thinking about alignment, and it's this. As the term constructive alignment would suggest, it's underpinned by a theory of social constructivism, and that's really crucial in terms of the design, because by design and from the very beginning, what that means is that we are conceptualizing or perceiving of the students as co-creators in their learning, people who, if we give them the opportunity and if we're transparent in relation to what it is we want them to learn, and we're clear in relation to what learning looks like and what the learning journey is for them, and if we also craft and scaffold them, that together we can do a much better job than we would do if we were working in isolation. So it really is important just to bear in mind that social constructivist theory that underpins this. Now, to look at the learning outcomes to begin with, whenever I think about writing learning outcomes, one of the first things that comes to mind is the acronym SMART. That it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, targeted, and so on. And that to me is the easy bit. I think the more challenging bit, really, in my experience, is ensuring that when you actually craft learning outcomes, that they're across the domains, the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor, in reflecting of the development of the whole person, that they allow for both. If you like, minimal competency to be demonstrated, but also the higher metacognitive learning that some students can demonstrate. And that's really important also, because sometimes when we talk about something that's measurable and that it's very specific and tangible, it can straitjacket, or it can, you know, kind of, if you like, reduce the opportunity for students with a capacity to demonstrate really higher order thinking and learning. And so I suppose what I'm talking about here is, you know, the students who are able to demonstrate, you know, transversal skills, adaptive expertise, where they're able to take something that they have learnt and apply it in a unique situation, which is of course what is the ideal. You know, this is one of our key principles. And the other thing to say there is that we, in writing learning outcomes, that we tend to start here. And it's not that we start here and then we don't go back to revisit, but it does give us a sense of the journey. And in my experience, again, what I tend to lean on here is backward design, using a number of taxonomies, like Bloom's taxonomy, Anderson's, Biggs, and so on. Because as I say to my students, and as I have to say here, I would find it extraordinarily difficult to write really well-crafted and purposeful learning outcomes without the scaffolding of the various taxonomies. And moving on to the learning activities, and I'll go back a bit, I'll go back to the previous slide just for a sec. Moving from the intended learning outcomes, which then inform the teaching and learning activities, we often make reference to the term conditions of performance. And really we use that term when we're writing more fine-grained learning outcomes in the context of specific lessons. But the idea applies at the macro level too. And it's that idea of creating conditions that are going to be as supportive as possible. And again, I tend to lean on certain frameworks. One of them, which you may be familiar with, is the RACE framework, which stands for Resources, Activities, Supports and Evaluation. It was crafted by Churchill and King and Fox in 2013. And again, it's a very useful framework when you're actually sitting there at the coalface and you're trying to figure out the resources, the supports, the activities, the conditions of learning that will actually support the students in meeting the learning outcomes. The last and the circle there, or oval there on the screen, relates to the assessment tasks. And beside it in green, we've noted what we call criteria of performance. And of course, the criteria are different. They're multi-levels, ideally. Because on the one hand, some of them at the very least need to be accessible to everybody, and then there needs to be some potential for people, as I said previously, to demonstrate very higher order skills and knowledge acquisition. But at each level, the assessment tasks need to be developed so that we can make fair, valid, and reliable inferences. And that really, for me, is what happens when you drill down in the process of constructive alignment. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass to Michael here just to give a view from the trenches, because as Michael said in the beginning, we're practitioners as well as theorists and researchers. So we really want to balance the two in our talk this afternoon. Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Zita. I just want to go back and maybe say, just to reiterate something you said, Zita, and I'd like to say it again because it's interesting. You said it today, and I heard it, and it was this: is that once the alignment concept gets in your head, it's extremely difficult to get it out of your head. In other words, once you begin to think in this way, it forces you, and I use the word force advisedly, it forces you to try and align your teaching with your teaching, the learning, and the assessment. Those three things, it really gets inside your head. Now that's the theory. That's the theory. The practice is that Zita and I have been. Look, we've chaired programs, we've directed programs, we've built modules, we've acted as external examiners, and you know, we've probably who was it? Sam Beckett said, fail and fail and fail, but fail better. So it's a real case of failing better every time. I think we've gotten better at it. Even writing learning outcomes. I see learning outcomes written in programs that I've been an external evaluator on, and I understand the difficulties the way they're written because they're too vague. You don't understand what they mean. So the challenge of realignment, this idea that within modules and across programs we need to think in a certain way, is a real challenge. And let me give you an example. And this is one that's kind of occupying a lot of my time and space at the moment. It's around critical and creative thinking. I just wonder how many of you are involved in programs or have been involved in quality assurance where one of the learning outcomes for the students is that our students will be critical and creative thinkers. I think it's a pretty common learning outcome or aspiration for programs. So in DCU, the graduate attributes, if you go on the website, you'll see that aspiration there. Now, I've had an opportunity over the last couple of years to engage at university level with, well, what does that mean in practice? How do we see it in our teaching? How do we see the students learning that? How do we assess it? Can you show me modules that deal with it? Can you show me programs in the business school or in the School of Computing or in education that can show some evidence that teaching, learning and assessment is aligned in such a way that we can show some value added for what DCU do? In other words, do we just bring in clever undergraduate students at first year and deliver the same kind of clever undergraduate students in fourth year and tell ourselves that we are creating critical and creative thinkers, and we go away without really understanding what has happened in the 4 years, where in our programs do we see that, how are people working together to develop that across the university? It's a real challenge. If any of you are interested in this, my colleagues and I have just published a paper on the assessment of critical thinking in higher education. Now, it comes with an advisory. It's a very narrow definition of critical thinking. It's really about analysis and synthesis. And when you read the paper, you'll understand what it is we're trying to do in a very narrow sense around critical thinking. But my argument is that I think I've been engaged in some pretty interesting conversations about critical thinking over the past 3 years. And it's really then about saying, well, how are you teaching for it? What are the students learning? And how does the assessment piece fit in here? So all by way of saying that I think both Zita and I would be very sympathetic to the difficulties of the practice here. Just how hard it is to kind of align programs. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be trying, because we really believe that if you believe in certain kinds of learning theories, if you believe in certain kinds of ways of teaching and learning in the modern world, if you believe that your job is not just to stand up and deliver the material to the students, then I think that once that idea gets inside your head, it tends to stay there. It causes problems. But my sense is that there are problems worth solving for each of you in your own way. And by the way, there's no one right way. There's no one, we haven't got a magic bullet here. As I said, we have failed loads of times. And I've taught 400 people, and believe me, I've done a final exam. You know, I've had to, because, you know, the idea of doing multiple continuous assessments, I work on my own in the area. So, you know, I'm very practical as well, and I know Zita is as well. So we'll go on to question 2. And I suppose, again, we're kind of back in the theory, and I hope you don't mind, but we always feel, I suppose, that we need to say this is why we believe in this alignment idea. We think it matters and we think it's important. And we want to talk about 3 with you, which we have on the next slide, Laura. So for us, there's kind of 3, there's lots of reasons why you would want to do alignment. And again, once that threshold concept gets in your head and you get into it, Here are the kinds of payoffs that we've experienced. That in working together, and Zita and I kind of work together both across undergraduate, master's and doctoral programs, and also with our colleagues, that once you start to talk about alignment, then it tends to support the process of developing a shared understanding of what it is we're valuing in terms of learning and how they can be achieved. It tends to get that conversation up and going. The other thing it does is that it helps to deprivatize what people believe or what people believe other people learn. So people might say I'm a social constructivist, but you look at how they teach and how they assess and you go, hang on a second here, how does that fit with a social constructivist learning theory? And it also says, well, if you're going to do a 3-hour exam at the end of the year, and there is a value in doing a 3-hour exam, it's not that it's not valuable, there are times when it is valuable, but the point is that, do you have a good rationale for it? Why do you do it at the end? Why do you specifically do this kind of exam? And it's all the kind of things, and especially I was teaching, I started off 20 years ago teaching assessment courses, and very quickly my students began to kind of call me out. You say this and you assess us like this. And fair enough, you know, we know there are 385 of us, but isn't there a contradiction here in what you're saying? And I'll tell you this. To stand in front of 385 people and try and justify what you do is, it's a workout, and it's humbling, and it means that you've always got to stand up and say, I'm talking about theories here, I'm also talking about practical things, and sometimes what I would really love to do, I can't do, but that doesn't stop me trying. And then finally, it promotes this idea of high standards in assessment, learning and teaching by design, that once you get into the conversation about aligning learning and teaching, that conversation about standards tends to come up. It's almost unavoidable. Now, I just want to say something very briefly about high standards in assessment, just very briefly. And in actual fact, Peter and Karina and Laura, we could do a whole session on this. I'm not offering now, but I'm just saying there's a whole session here around high standards in assessment. But go on to the next slide for a second. And if you go searching in the literature, there's no end to the amount of websites and research papers that will describe high standards in assessment. We just took this one, we like it, but it's not any much better than other ones that we probably haven't found. But if I can just draw your attention to sort of that when you get into alignment, so look at number 2 there, it says feedback is used to actively improve student learning. Okay, so actively improve student learning, so high standards. So good assessment, high standards in assessment means that the feedback you use is used to actively improve student learning. Okay. Now you're trying to align teaching, learning and assessment, and you have a conversation with 3 colleagues, or you're a quality assurance person and you're going out into look at a program and you say, is there any evidence here that feedback is used actively to improve student learning? When is the feedback given? How is it given? Who gets it? What do they do with it? Okay. And folks, I understand what it's like to give feedback to 400 people. So does Zita. It's hard. It's hard. If you offer at the end of a lecture that people can email you questions that you will address with them, that's a big undertaking. It's a big commitment. But if you believe that you want to use feedback actively with 400 people, you might have to just walk that particular walk. I'm not saying, by the way, that that's the best way of doing it. I'm just saying that I've been there, and it's meant, you know, a couple of hours after lectures, just responding to questions and queries and so on and so forth. And sometimes actually, you know, what you discover in that sense is that the same kinds of questions are coming up, and what you do is you gather up the questions together and you might write one answer. And so there are ways. Look at number 5. Assessment for learning is central to subject and program design and is a focus for staff and institutional development. Assessment for learning is hard. It requires a lot of skill to do it well. And if you are a quality assurance person and you're looking at programs and you're saying high quality assessment means that some attention has to be paid to assessment for learning. It's not just all about the end assessment. Well then, is it in the program? And how does the institution support its staff in terms of professional development? I'll come back to this in a minute. And institutional development of the staff.
Can I for 1 second before you go on? Just before you go on, it strikes me as well that when you were talking about point 2 there, feedback being used actively to improve student learning, in my experience, feedback from students has had the biggest influence on the quality of my teaching. Correct. And also on the quality of the assignments that I develop. Correct. And I'm talking about, as you've described there, I'm talking about working with 435 students in an auditorium, and I'm also talking about you working with 20 students. It's the same principle, and it's that principle of being willing to punctuate the teaching and the planned journey, if you like, of learning in real time, to make sure that the learning activities, how you're teaching, the supports that you're providing is actually meeting the students' needs. So when we talk about that alignment principle, it really does. It works both at the level of original design, but it also works just as importantly in the actual, dare I say it, delivery or engagement, in the 40 or 50-minute lectures. Yeah. And you mentioned there, getting feedback from students. This is where blended learning, really does have some advantages. I've just discovered VVox in the last little while, and the kind of assessment for learning techniques that Michael and I would automatically use, even with a very large group of students in an auditorium, a lot of the time, to their absolute horror, when we leave the podium and start going up and down and saying, okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to wait until we get 5 responses. We want these to be rolling responses. It takes a while. That threshold concept of alignment has implications for roles and responsibilities, even within teaching and learning as it is proceeding. And the extent to which alignment really works is as much a responsibility and an acceptance of a new role on the behalf of the students, where they feel that they have both a right and an obligation to drive the way in which assessment, teaching and learning is crafted and designed, and also a trust that if they do put their heads above the parapet and they genuinely give you feedback, either in the form of an exit card or in a VVox poll or whatever else, that you will actually run with that, and that it will, during the course of the module, potentially have an impact on the way in which something is taught the next time, the opportunities that are provided to them, and so on. I think that, we talk about multi-directional feedback, and we talk about contingency in assessment, learning and teaching. And in a way, I think everything we're saying today has got to be underpinned by that idea of contingency, and by that idea that we are open to learning, whether we're the QA person or the teacher or the module chair or the external examiner or the student. Those roles are reciprocal, if you like. Yeah, and I can absolutely. I mean, I've learned so much in the last 20 years about and about how important it is to first of all to make the students feel that you actually care about what they're learning. And also saying, if you do that, if you say, look, I really am interested in what you're learning, then automatically it happens. You've got to say, well, then you've got to tell me how to teach you better. You've got to help me. You got to help me help you learn better.
It's almost like, as I said, once this idea gets in your head, it tends to call out hypocrisy, I suppose, is really what I'm saying. You can no longer just stroll in and, you know, deliver the lecture and walk out and say, right, that's it, my job's done. Do you want to, will we go on to question 3?
I will but before we do, Joe has just asked a question here, which I think is, we could pick up here. He asked, at what point does class size tip to mitigate against best delivery practice? And so beyond that size, there can be no solution. It's, you know, initially a resource decision to have class. A few years ago, Joe, I would have said that, you know, there was no potential really in large groupings to actually engage students. But it's not true. And I have to tell you, I'm not one of those people who enjoys I don't like the limelight very much. So it doesn't really suit me, you know, to be going up and down and in and out between rows of students, and calling across and saying, I'm going to stick with this, you know, until I get a couple of, you know, responses for you, or to say at the end, you know, please, you don't need to give me feedback here, but I'll take anything you give, and it can be anonymous, and I will then come back and I will talk to that. It's amazing how much you can actually get, even from a very large group, if you go in with the mindset that it is going to be interactive, it is going to be dialogical. And I've also had the other scenario where, for whatever reason, you know, you're working with a small group and maybe the trust isn't there, or maybe people just don't feel comfortable. Of course, there's that affective dimension, you know, when you expect people to, or students to, anybody to engage with you. And there are times when you actually have to stop out of respect and deference to the students and say, look, you know, give me an idea as to what would work. I still need to get your voice, and I'm still going to persist because it's just so important. But I'm obviously the way I'm doing it is not the right hook. So I don't know if that answers exactly.
Yeah, could I get in here as well and say, you again, I think you said something really important there. And I think maybe it's another thing, Joe, about the numbers. Sometimes it can be extremely difficult to do it with 50, and it can be easy to do with 400. There's also very much the person who's teaching to take account of. It is hard for some people to engage with very large numbers of students. Now, I don't know who Joe is. I don't know what kind of person he is. And I think you've got two people here who are very different. Zita is, like, you wouldn't know it, but she is very quiet. And I don't know whether you've picked up on my personality, but I'm a bit loud, and I'm a bit like, and I absolutely love teaching large groups. I love being on that stage. It's something I absolutely love. And sometimes I feel more comfortable, like Richard Nixon. They said Richard Nixon was more comfortable in front of 50,000 people than in front of 5 people. But I hope I'm not a crook like Richard Nixon. But I really feel that sometimes that when people start to talk about this as well, we forget that it's not just the numbers of people in front. It's also the person who's teaching. That that the kind of person you are can make this sometimes a little easier and sometimes really hard. And one of the things I would say as well is that if you're going to try something like this with a large group of people, you begin very small, very tiny, small steps. But one of the things that I would advise you to do is that if you believe in assessment, teaching and learning, you should tell your students that this is what you would like to do. Make them aware of what it is you would like to do, and say, every now and then, I'm going to try to get some information from you. And here is why I'm doing that, right? Because I'm interested in your learning. I want to improve my teaching, and I think you'll be able to help me out here. And maybe every now and then I might get you to write down on a piece of paper and drop it off on my desk on the way by, something that I might have not explained very well. I mean, I'm talking about small steps. Sorry, we could talk. This is something we've talked a lot about in terms of our own teaching as well. And we've taught together. So it means that, you know, we would be conscious of each other in terms of the different styles of teaching. And I think it's sometimes with aligning, you know, the alignment is also about the person who's actually teaching. We forget to say that sometimes. And it just struck me there, Zita, not something we had planned to say, but I think it's important.
Will we go on to the next slide, please, Laura? So we're coming towards the end here, and this is the third question, folks. What challenges does alignment present for colleagues involved in program or module design and or quality assurance based work? There are many. Could we go to the next slide, please, Laura? What we've done here is we've just, put together a little potpourri of challenges that we think are particularly important, certainly important to us at this juncture. And I'm just going to mention two, if you don't mind, given the time. So if you look at the one at 12 o'clock there, mental models of assessment, learning and teaching based on apprenticeships of observation. Again, the notion of the apprenticeship of observation comes from a scholar called Lorty. For the life of me, I can't remember her first name. And it's a very simple notion, but again, it's one of those wonderful threshold ideas, and it's our concepts, and it's that, we've all been students, we've all been teachers in some respect, we've been through the system probably for 20, 25 years, depending, and probably are still, well, clearly we're still involved in it. And through that apprenticeship, over that period, we get apprenticed into the roles of the teacher, the roles, what is appropriate for the teacher to do, what is the role and function of student vis-a-vis assessment and so on, and what are the right kind of dynamics, and that is linked to what's at 3 o'clock there, the lay theories of what constitutes valid, fair and reliable assessments. And all I've got to do, to make this point, I think, is just to point to the conversations, the ongoing conversations and frustrations in relation to the traditional Leaving Cert and the calculated grades processes currently. And, you listen to the minister, trying to make her case, and students making their cases, and teachers being concerned about the quality of assessment and so on. And the reality is that the key point and the key takeaway here, I think, is that we need to be mindful that of our lay theories, and if at all possible, in conversations, I suppose, create some kind of place or time or space, ideally a safe one, where conversations about how we are actually, what we believe in and what drives the way in which we design and the way in which we teach can actually be articulated and not necessarily challenged, but just shared in a meaningful and an accepting way to begin with, because I think that we learn so much through that kind of social construction and deconstruction. Michael, you wanted to come in about assessment literacy.
Just briefly, Zita, I just suppose I want to make, the 2 points I'd like to talk about, or two things that are dear to my heart as well, is at 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock. So just let me talk very quickly about assessment literacy. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the assumption that everyone can do assessment well is something that we really have to question. And I'm not just talking about anyone in further education, higher education, primary education, right? So that is the whole issue, is that to do assessment well, there are a lot of skills involved. And assessment really is about gathering, recording, interpreting, using, communicating information about learning to help make decisions. So assessment is about decision making. So if you think about it, everything about assessment, whether it's medical assessment or educational assessment, it's about decision making. So the learner, in 5-year-old who is encouraged to self-assess and say, am I doing a good job? They're gathering information to say, have I coloured inside the circle well enough that I couldn't do it better? It's saying, can I make a decision about how well I'm doing that? So if you think about it, we go into a driving test and the person in the car with us is gathering information to help him or her make a decision. Now, assessment literacy then is about gathering the information and interpreting it at a very high level so you make good decisions. So I suppose high assessment literacy, those people with high assessment literacy tend to make good decisions about learning. And high assessment literacy does not come by accident. It requires professional development, it requires commitment, it requires practice. I've been at it a long time, I'm pretty good at it, but I tell you, I'm still learning. assessment priorities. Peter mentioned this actually earlier. The trouble is that what we assess tends to be valued, and what we don't assess doesn't get valued. But the trouble is, and I think from a quality assurance point of view, if I was to go in now and look, I would look at, and I would often see probably too many assessments. And I think it's kind of what's happened is that well, that's important and that's important and that's important and that's important. So we have to assess everything. We've got everything is important, so we assess it. So there's two things going on here. There is the backwash effect of assessment. So what you assess is what gets valued in terms of teaching and in terms of learning. But then if there's no prioritization whatsoever, you have an overload. And then if you have an overload, it means that, okay, you might have solved the prioritization issue, but unfortunately, the students are exhausted. So it's a real challenge in terms of alignment.
And the other bit,
yeah.
The other bit there is the atomization. So you end up having a whole lot of little bits, and the students can't make the connections, and we can't make the connections, and then you've got something which is just not coherent. It's bigger than the sum of its parts, if you like, for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Laura, could we? Sorry, Michael, we've got to.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one thing again. We've both of us have really worked at this, and there are things that we've done that have been successful and things that we have failed again to try and do. So it's a real challenge. That's it, Zita. Yeah, I suppose we're kind of running out of time at this stage. So we don't have a lot of time left.
So we'll just flag something on the next slide, if we could, Laura, please. We've recently come to know about this, for want of it, to put it crudely. It's a very good framework, we think, and it's our gift, if you like, to you as we come to a close. Could you go on to the next slide, Laura, please? It was designed by Bierman and colleagues in Australia, in the context of higher education, and they have a guideline document which can be accessed using the link on the slide there, which takes you through, or takes somebody who's interested in assessment through 6 key categories as listed there on the circle. So they go in the case of each one, and maybe actually, Laura, could you go ahead to feedback just for, it's 2 slides ahead, please. So just going back one, thank you. So this is, if you like, the very summarized version of it. But in respect of each of these different components of assessment, what they do is they challenge us, they present us with a number of questions which challenge some really fundamental understandings and indeed decisions about why things are done in a certain way, and to what extent, and this is the important part, to what extent the assessment element actually contributes as intended to optimizing student learning. So as a parting gift, if you like, we would just suggest to you that maybe you'd like to take a look at this. And as I said, there's a website linked with it, but I have found just through initial browsing that the framework document that builds on these small slides actually provide a very useful framework for investigation, whether you're designing the module, whether you're chairing it, whether you're the QA or whatever. And Laura, could I ask you just to pop ahead for a second? Keep going until I say stop, if that's okay. There you go. Okay, so I suppose what we want to do is to say thank you at this point, and maybe just give a couple of minutes. I know we've probably run over a little bit here. There are bound to be issues that are bubbling up, and we just hope that there are some key takeaways that may be useful. Thanks for your time, folks. We appreciate it, and for your attention.
That's great. Thank you so much, Zita and Michael. That's been such a frank and open conversation. I suppose really, perhaps if just while we're getting Alison's slides up there, maybe if we could ask you to reflect on a lot of feedback we've been getting from people, is really how to commence that reassessment, that look at redesign of assessment, now that they've captured maybe some practice during these very strange times that they'd like to keep on board. I see Ronan has quite a detailed question in the chat there. But perhaps if we could look maybe at the bigger picture of what your top tips would be to maybe get people started along the line of realignment. How important is it with regard to authentic assessment to ensure that the learning outcomes and things like that are linked in? But if you wouldn't mind, if we could maybe just swing over to Alison's slides now for a minute, just to give her a quick chance to let people know, and if you could maybe come back in then at the end and finish off with that particular question or an answer to that question, that would be fantastic. Over to you, Alison. You're not muted there, Alison, are you? We can certainly see your slides, but I think you're on mute.
If you just hang on a sec, I'm just going to see if I can change Alison there.
Any questions that haven't been answered, we'll try and get the presenters to perhaps get back to you. Again, any topics that you have for future events like this, please let us know. We're interested in hearing, and you know, I suppose we are working on the basis of feedback that we received from our first session where we did survey you. I can see that Alison still has a mute tag on her there. Again, we will be recording, well, we have recorded this event and we will be sending out the recording to any colleagues that couldn't make it along today. Unfortunately, we usually do this at lunchtime. We couldn't make lunchtime today, but it seems to be much more accessible to more people. But there's no problem in trying to expand that. Well, look, why don't we ask our presenters to answer that particular question maybe, and then while we give Laura a chance to sort Alison's mic out there. So maybe back to yourself and Michael on that bigger, how do the QA practitioners particularly get people kick-started along this kind of redesign issue?
There are two things that come to mind. I'm happy just to come in initially. It's a big question, obviously, but in my experience, you need to have, one needs to have some kind of focal point. So rather than talking in theory, I think it's really helpful to have some artifacts, some examples, ideally at different levels that you know, allow a conversation to evolve in relation to and which exemplify different levels of alignment and clarity and so on. That though is I'm presupposing though that you also have somebody or bodies who are party to the conversation, who are willing to have their work reviewed and critiqued, because there's a very significant vulnerability in opening yourself up and your materials for critical review, particularly if what you genuinely want to do is to engage in meaningful discussion so that you end up with, you know, some good ideas in relation to how to progress something, but that you don't feel, you know, awfully demoted or demoralized by the process. So my recommendation would be to deliberately find somebody or bodies who are comfortable in being the focus of inquiry, who are comfortable in sharing their work, and who ask as many questions and invite as many questions as perhaps the QA people do, because I think that sets a tone where everybody feels that it's okay, it's a safe place to have that conversation. That would be one of the main things that I would say in relation to this, because the conversation has to be real and it has to be worthwhile. And if it's just a talking shop, then there isn't a huge amount of learning. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, I'll just add by saying what I was going to say is that if I was doing quality assurance, my top tip would be to say people, please don't work on your own. Like, don't work on your own. Work with other people. And Zita has expressed it perfectly. Like, try to work in a small group of people that you trust. So the recommendation would be, if you want to make these changes, it's hard. It requires confidence in getting feedback from people that you are not going to make you feel bad about what it is you're doing. And this notion of a learning community, a small group of people committed to making the changes together. And so it's it's a version of small steps, but in this case, it's small groups of people kind of working together rather than this big, huge institutional change, which I think sometimes is extremely difficult to manage and to quality assure. So that's where I would agree with Zita completely. Is find maybe one or two people and then get another group of people around them that will work in a way that is a safe way, because some of this is there's a lot of failure involved in this in trying to change assessments and stuff. I mean, it's risky stuff, but it's not the kind of stuff that you should be afraid of either, because it will pay dividends. And we've been down this path with groups of colleagues. Yeah. Can
I also add to that and just say that if somebody puts themselves forward, and I'm thinking more broadly, let's say, so if the QA team wants to work with somebody from the inside with a larger group, I do think that there needs to be some kind of quid pro quo, to put it crudely, because it takes such a lot of time to actually, unless everything is already up in the VLE, to make things available and to discuss things and so on. It takes so much time that maybe and sometimes the learning is lost unless literally you start with the end in mind and say, look, this is not just about getting together for an hour and a half. This is, the purpose here is to try to address a number of agreed questions which are of meaning and significance to the people involved, that can be applied in a reasonably short time frame to their benefit and to the benefit of everybody else. So there's some sense of both of a quid pro quo. I saw John asking the question there about using digital means. I think that feedback through digital means is a great way of doing it, because I think an awful lot of the work and also the document trail can be captured through digital means. I think that's a very good idea. Again, provided that and this is always the case in communities of practice, I think, provided there's kind of rules of engagement. I think I think the minding the people involved and ensuring that they come out of it feeling, better and more enabled is really important.
Okay, that's great. And of course, minding the students that you're assessing.
Absolutely.
Always being a priority, which is why we're all here today. And I think what you're saying really is things like learning outcomes are really to the forefront. Well, listen, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Alison now, because it's really important that people understand that the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning have a range of resources open to everyone across the entire system. So thank you so much. Off you go, Alison.
Okay, that fatal line, can you hear me now? Okay, can you hear me now, Karina or Laura?
Sorry, yeah, we can hear you very clearly. Off you go.
Super. I'm sorry about that. I'm not going to keep you long at all, colleagues. I have a few slides here, but they're a heads up for a one-page document that I've put together in consultation with Laura and Karina, just to give you a sense of the resources that we have and some professional development opportunities that are available, either coming up now or that are recorded already. Pretty much everything I'm saying aligns directly with what Zita and Michael have been saying around shared understandings and principles. So the first thing that I'm mentioning here is that we in the National Forum did an enhancement theme from 2016 to 2018, and there have been lots of outcomes from that. But probably one of the most important ones is the principles of assessment of for and as learning, and colleagues may find that very useful, and that's noted on the one-page document along with other resources. The next slide, please, Laura. In the next slide here, I'm just telling you about some of the resources we put together as immediate response to COVID-19. And so these documents draw on all the principles that were designed across the enhancement theme. And there's also a link there to a collaborative spreadsheet, which is resources from across the sector that colleagues contributed, and also ones that we curated from international sources. The third thing that I'm going to mention is the National Forum Seminar Series. So I know I've seen that some of the names and some of the colleagues on the call have contributed to seminars on assessment, and some really, really strong work has been done on assessment in the seminar series. So I just went into the events link in our website, and these are the ones that are coming up with assessment in the title. But as Zita and Michael have said, assessment is infused across all of our work. But they might be interesting. They're free for everybody. You can just sign up. If you've any trouble getting into any of these sessions, just drop us an email and we'll help you out with that. The fourth and second last thing I'm going to mention is the collaborative work that we've been doing with QQI. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the amazing National Academic Integrity Week, which had so many different events going on. And a lot of those events, the recordings are on the link that's available here. And we've also been doing really interesting work around work-based assessment. I'm sure many of the people on the call have been involved maybe in some of those events, but all of that material is also available for you. And the last thing I'm going to mention now is that we have an open course starting on the 12th of March around programme-focused assessment. So it's just interested in what Michael was saying there. If you're going to do any of this work, talk to other people. And those are ideas about module assessment being fragmented, where it doesn't involve conversations across a programme, where there's alignment not only within the module but across the programme. That makes a lot more sense for our students, to help them to make those connections. So of course, as with all the other materials, this is free for anybody who wants to get involved. Maybe some of you did the UDL course recently. There were huge numbers on that, and people do find these very helpful. Last slide I have here is contact information. We like to hear from people. We'd love to hear from you. Everything I've mentioned is on our website. My email address is there. You can sign up for updates. We're on Twitter. And if you have any feedback on anything we've mentioned, or if when you get the one-page document there's something that doesn't work or that you can't find, please get in touch with us and we'll follow up with you directly. Thanks ever so much for your time.
That's great, Alison, and apologies to everybody for running over time. It was very hard to cut Zita and Michael off, but it's important to be aware of all these resources that are available. But at the end of the day, you can't beat listening to the practice and experience of the providers that are out there on the front line. So if there is anyone else that would like to present along this particular line on assessment, it's not just necessarily a COVID context, it's really something that we're going to be facing into the longer haul, and QQI are looking forward to coming out and talking to stakeholders to see what our next steps will be. And of course, we will continue to collaborate with the National Forum. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you for our excellent presenters and your lovely casual advice and your easy manner and all of that. You've certainly made it sound far less alarming than I suppose we all know it is. So thanks again, and best of luck to everybody, and we'll be sending this recording out. Well done. Thanks, guys.